The year is 1885. The air in the Kentucky foothills is thick with the acrid smoke of pine and something else, something heavier, something that smells of burnt flesh and old secrets. On this moonless night in the hollows outside of Blackwood Creek, a fire rages, but it is no ordinary blaze. The flames are a sickly, unnatural green and yellow, clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. They consume the small, isolated cabin with a ravenous hunger, yet they give off no discernible heat. The men of the town, gathered at a safe distance with torches and pitchforks, feel only a profound, bone-deep cold. They whisper amongst themselves, their voices tight with fear and a dark, triumphant righteousness. They speak of the woman who lived there, a recluse known only as Alara, the witch of Hemlock Ridge. They say she communed with dark spirits, soured the milk in their cows, and stole the breath from their newborns. Tonight, they sought to purge their land of her evil. But as the cabin's warped timbers groan and collapse into a heap of glowing embers, a collective gasp ripples through the crowd. The screams they had expected to hear, the pleas for mercy from a woman trapped in the inferno, never came. Instead, they heard something far more disturbing. From the heart of the fire, a sound like a child's soft laughter echoed through the woods, a chilling, ethereal sound that froze the blood in their veins. The fire was meant to be an ending, a violent, definitive full stop to a chapter of fear that had gripped their community for years. It was supposed to be a cleansing. They would soon learn, to their everlasting horror, that it was not an ending at all. It was a birth. They had not destroyed a curse, they had merely set it free. As dawn broke, casting long, gray fingers of light through the skeletal trees, the fire had finally exhausted itself. All that remained of the witch's cabin was a blackened, smoldering scar upon the earth. The unnatural cold lingered, a palpable presence that clung to the morning mist. Sheriff Brody, a man whose pragmatism was constantly at war with the superstitions of his flock, led a small, reluctant posse to sift through the ashes. They were looking for remains, for some tangible proof that the woman Alara had perished in the blaze they had set. They found nothing. No bones charred beyond recognition, no teeth, not even a scrap of fabric that could be identified as clothing. It was as if she had simply vanished, evaporated into the smoke and shadows. This absence was more terrifying than any corpse could have been. It fed the growing legend that she was never truly human to begin with, but they did find something. In the very center of the cabin's footprint, sitting atop a pile of white ash as if placed there deliberately, was a single object, miraculously untouched by the inferno. It was a small porcelain doll. Its painted blue eyes stared up at the grim Kentucky sky with a vacant, knowing expression. Its crimson-painted lips were curled into a faint, unnerving smile. The doll's calico dress was pristine, without a single scorch mark. Its porcelain skin was cool to the touch, despite having rested in the heart of a blaze that had melted glass and warped iron. Sheriff Brody, a man who feared God but not much else, felt a tremor of pure dread. This object was wrong. It was an impossibility, a relic from a forbidden place. He didn't know it then, but this doll was not just a survivor of the fire. It was a vessel, a new home for the malevolence that had once inhabited the cabin. The fire had burned, but the evil had not died. It had simply changed its form, waiting patiently for a new family to claim it. To understand the fire, one must first understand the fear that lit the match. It had begun 2 years earlier, in the spring of 1883. Alara Vance arrived in Blackwood Creek as if from nowhere. She was not old or hunched like the witches in stories, but a woman of indeterminate age, with eyes the color of a stormy sky and hair as black as a raven's wing. She bought a secluded plot of land deep in the Hemlock Ridge, paying with old gold coins that the bank teller swore felt cold to the touch, even on a warm day. She spoke little, kept to herself, and built her cabin with her own hands, using timber from the surrounding woods. The people of Blackwood Creek were a closed community, deeply suspicious of outsiders. A solitary woman choosing to live so far from the town's meager comforts was in itself an act of defiance, a statement of otherness that they could not comprehend. Rumors began to fester like untended wounds. They said she was a widow from a plague-stricken town back east, or perhaps a woman of ill repute who had been cast out of a more civilized society. But the darkest whispers took on a more supernatural tone. They were fueled by the isolation of her dwelling and her strange habits. She was seen gathering herbs and roots at twilight, speaking to the crows in a language that sounded like crackling leaves, and wandering the woods during the full moon. Her presence was a stone dropped into the still, dark pond of the community's collective psyche, and the ripples of paranoia were spreading fast. The cabin itself became a thing of macabre folklore, a place children were warned away from, a dark spot on their mental map of the world. It stood not just as a home, but as a monument to everything they did not understand, and therefore, everything they had begun to hate. The architecture of fear requires a foundation, and Alara's reputation was built upon a series of unsettling, inexplicable events. It started subtly. A farmer whose land bordered Alara's property reported that his prize-winning sow had given birth to a litter of stillborn, deformed piglets. He swore he'd seen Alara standing at his fence line the night before, staring at the barn under the pale moonlight. Then Mrs. Gable, the town's most prolific gossip, developed a sudden, wasting sickness. She withered away in her bed, babbling about a woman with storm-gray eyes who visited her in her dreams, her touch like ice. The doctor could find no cause for her ailment. Weeks later, a blight swept through the cornfields on the west side of the ridge, turning the stalks black and the ears to dust, while the fields on the other side remained untouched. It was noted, in hushed tones over prayer meetings and church socials, that the blighted fields were all within a mile of the witch's cabin. These incidents taken alone could be dismissed as misfortune, the harsh realities of rural life in the 19th century, but woven together they created a disturbing tapestry of perceived malevolence. Alara became the scapegoat for every hardship, the focal point for all the community's anxieties. She was never seen in town, never bought supplies, which only deepened the mystery of her survival. How did she eat? How did she endure the harsh Kentucky winters? The townspeople concluded that she must be sustained by unnatural means, that she bartered with dark forces for her sustenance. The cabin on Hemlock Ridge was no longer just the home of a strange woman. It was the lair of a predator, a source of a creeping, invisible poison that was seeping into the soil of their lives. And the fear was beginning to curdle into something far more dangerous: hatred. The story of the witch's cabin is inextricably linked to the tragic tale of the Hemlock family. John Hemlock was a stern, God-fearing farmer, a man whose life was governed by the predictable rhythms of the seasons and the unwavering words of the Bible. He, his wife Martha, and their 7-year-old daughter Sarah lived on a homestead that was the closest to Alara Vance's forbidden property. From their porch they could sometimes see a thin wisp of smoke rising from her chimney, a gray smudge against the endless green of the forest. John Hemlock forbade his family from even speaking Alara's name, believing it would invite evil into their home. But curiosity is a powerful force in a child's heart. Little Sarah was a quiet, imaginative girl, prone to wandering. One October afternoon, she was chasing a monarch butterfly along the edge of their property when it fluttered over the old stone wall that marked the beginning of Alara's land. Ignoring her father's dire warnings, Sarah climbed the wall and disappeared into the shadowed woods. When she failed to return for supper, a frantic search began. John and Martha, their hearts pounding with a primal terror, called her name until their voices were raw. The sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of blood and bruised purple. It was Martha who found her just as twilight bled into night. Sarah was sitting at the edge of a small clearing, not far from the witch's cabin, staring silently at a crude doll made of twigs and twine that lay in her lap. She was unharmed, but she was different. Her eyes, once bright and full of life, were distant and clouded. She did not respond to her mother's cries of relief. She simply stared into the deepening gloom, as if listening to a conversation no one else could hear. Bringing Sarah home did not bring her back. The vibrant, laughing child who had chased a butterfly into the woods was gone, replaced by a silent, hollow-eyed specter. She refused to eat. She would sit in her rocking chair for hours, staring out the window towards Hemlock Ridge, clutching the strange little twig doll she'd brought back from the woods. At night, her parents would be woken by her blood-curdling screams. Yet when they rushed to her room, they would find her sitting bolt upright in bed, eyes wide with a terror she could not or would not explain. She began to draw compulsively on any surface she could find: scraps of paper, the floorboards, the frost on the window panes. Her drawings were always the same: a tall stick-figure house with chaotic, spiraling smoke pouring from the chimney, and next to it, a tall, thin figure with long, grasping arms. John Hemlock, a man of simple faith and simpler solutions, was consumed by a helpless rage. He burned the twig doll in the fireplace, but Sarah only grew more distant, her silence deepening into a catatonic state. The town doctor was summoned, a man of limited medical knowledge who bled Sarah with leeches and prescribed laudanum to no effect. He eventually confessed he could find no physical ailment, muttering under his breath that some sicknesses were of the soul, beyond the reach of medicine. For John and Martha, the conclusion was inescapable. Their daughter had trespassed on cursed ground. She had encountered the witch, and Alara Vance had stolen her spirit, leaving an empty shell behind. The quiet fear that had simmered in Blackwood Creek for 2 years now had a face, the face of a suffering child. The community's paranoia had found its martyr. The whispers for retribution grew louder, more insistent. The seeds of violence were being sown in the fertile ground of a father's grief and a town's terror. The winter of 1884 was brutal, blanketing the Kentucky hills in a suffocating shroud of snow and ice. The isolation it imposed only amplified the town's paranoia. Inside the Hemlock farmhouse, the situation grew more dire. Sarah's condition had deteriorated into something truly horrifying. She had begun speaking, but the voice that came from her lips was not her own. It was a low, rasping whisper, speaking in a strange, guttural language filled with clicks and hisses. Her body would contort into unnatural positions, her small frame racked with violent convulsions. During these fits, the temperature in the room would plummet, and the candles would flicker and die, plunging the family into terrifying, icy darkness. Martha, broken by grief, spent her days praying, her rosary beads worn smooth by her trembling fingers. But John Hemlock's grief had hardened into a diamond-hard certainty. He saw this not as a tragedy, but as an act of war. Every one of Sarah's seizures, every guttural whisper, was a direct attack from the woman on the ridge. He began to talk not of healing, but of justice, of purging the evil. His words found fertile soil in the hearts of his neighbors, who saw the Hemlocks suffering as a dire warning of what could happen to their own families. The story of Sarah Hemlock became a cautionary tale told around every hearth, a piece of macabre folklore taking root in real time. The witch, they said, was growing bolder, her power reaching beyond her property line to poison the very heart of their community. Something had to be done. A dark consensus was forming, a silent agreement passed in grim nods and hardened glares. They were a flock without a shepherd, and a wolf was at their door. If the law and the church could not protect them, they would protect themselves. If you find these forbidden corners of history as compelling as we do, consider subscribing, because the whispers in Blackwood Creek were about to turn into screams. As the first thaws of spring 1885 began to break winter's hold, the tension in Blackwood Creek reached its breaking point. John Hemlock, his face now a permanent mask of grim resolve, had become the unofficial leader of a growing faction of townsmen. They met in secret in barns and back rooms, their discussions lit by the flickering orange glow of lanterns and fueled by cheap whiskey and righteous indignation. They were farmers, blacksmiths, and merchants, ordinary men pushed to an extraordinary edge. They spoke of the old world, of the ways their ancestors had dealt with such evil. They spoke of fire and purification. Sheriff Brody was aware of the growing unrest. He was a man caught in an impossible position. He had no evidence that Alara Vance had committed any crime. Trespassing was not a hanging offense, and stealing a child's soul was not a charge he could take before a judge. He rode out to the cabin on Hemlock Ridge once, determined to speak with the woman, to warn her of the town's mood. He found the cabin silent and shuddered. He knocked on the door, his calls echoing unanswered in the dense woods. As he turned to leave, he noticed strange symbols carved into the doorframe, glyphs that resembled coiled snakes and broken stars. A chill unrelated to the crisp spring air ran down his spine. He felt as though he were being watched by 1,000 unseen eyes. His visit only served to deepen the mystery and, in the eyes of the town, confirm Alara's guilt. The sheriff's failure to act was seen as impotence, proof that the law of man was powerless against the forces of darkness. John Hemlock and his followers knew then that the responsibility fell to them. They began to plan. They were no longer just talking, they were preparing for a hunt. The catalyst for the final, horrifying act came on a humid evening in late April. Sarah Hemlock suffered her most violent episode yet. For nearly an hour she thrashed in her bed, her back arching at an impossible angle as she shrieked in that horrible, inhuman voice. But this time she spoke a single, clear word in English, a word that would seal Alara Vance's fate. "Fire," she hissed, her eyes rolling back in her head. "She wants the fire." For John Hemlock, this was a prophecy. A direct challenge from the witch. He saw it as a sign from God, a divine sanction for the violence he was about to unleash. He burst from the farmhouse, his face a mess of tears and fury, and ran to the church, ringing the bell with a frantic, desperate energy. The discordant clang echoed through the hollow, a sound not of worship but of alarm. It was the signal. Men poured out of their homes, their faces illuminated by the torches they carried. They were armed with axes, hunting rifles, and pitchforks. They were a mob, stripped of their individuality and fused into a single organism of fear and rage. Martha Hemlock tried to stop her husband, pleading with him that this was madness, but he brushed her aside, his eyes fixed on the dark silhouette of Hemlock Ridge. Sheriff Brody arrived, pistol drawn, and attempted to reason with the crowd, but his voice was drowned out by the angry roar. He was one man against 50, a lone boulder against a tidal wave of hatred. The mob, led by the grieving, vengeful father, began their slow march up the muddy path toward the witch's cabin, their torches cutting a jagged, fiery wound in the darkness. They were a river of fire, flowing towards a single, isolated point, intent on erasure and purification. The night air, thick with the scent of damp earth and pine, now carried something else, the promise of violence. The procession moved through the woods like a mythical beast, its many heads bobbing torches, its collective voice a low, guttural growl of curses and prayers. The forest, usually alive with the sounds of the night, fell deathly silent, as if holding its breath. When they reached the clearing, the cabin stood before them, dark and silent. A single candle flickered in the lone window, a tiny, defiant star against an abyss. The sight of it only fueled their fury. There was no discussion, no trial, no accusation. Their verdict had been rendered months ago in their fearful hearts. John Hemlock, his face illuminated by the torch he held aloft, strode to the front. He shouted Alara's name, his voice cracking with emotion. "Show yourself, witch, face God's judgment." The only reply was the sighing of the wind through the pines and the frantic crackle of their torches. The silence from within the cabin was interpreted not as absence, but as contempt. It was the final insult. With a roar of collective rage, the mob descended. They didn't just want to burn the cabin, they wanted to annihilate it. They smashed the windows, the sound of shattering glass sharp and violent in the night. They threw their torches onto the dry timber of the roof and tossed oil-soaked rags through the broken panes. The small structure, built of wood aged by 2 harsh winters, was consumed with shocking speed. The flames erupted, painting the horrified and triumphant faces of the mob in a hellish, dancing light. It was then that the fire turned that sickening, unnatural green, and the bone-chilling cold descended upon the clearing. And it was then that they heard it, not the scream of a dying woman, but the soft, lilting laughter of a child, seeming to come from the very heart of the impossible flames. The morning after the fire, as Sheriff Brody and his men sifted through the cooling ashes, the town of Blackwood Creek awoke to a new reality. The source of their fear was gone, reduced to a blackened patch of earth, but the fear itself did not vanish, it mutated. The absence of Alara's body was a terrifying mystery that hung over the community like a funeral shroud. Did she burn to nothing? Did she use her dark powers to escape, or was she never there at all? The discovery of the pristine porcelain doll only compounded the horror. It was an object that defied logic, a sinister miracle. Sheriff Brody, against his better judgment, took the doll and logged it as evidence, though he wasn't sure of what crime. He locked it away in a small wooden box in his office, hoping to contain its unsettling presence. But the story of the doll, the unburnt thing from the heart of the witch's fire, spread through the town like a contagion. John Hemlock, however, felt a grim sense of peace. His daughter, Sarah, had fallen into deep, peaceful sleep the moment the cabin had collapsed. When she awoke the next morning, the clouds in her eyes had lifted. She was weak and confused, with no memory of the past few months, but she was herself again. To John and the rest of the town, this was the ultimate proof. They had done the right thing. They had faced down evil and won. They had saved the child by destroying the monster. The fire on Hemlock Ridge was not seen as an act of mob violence, but as a righteous exorcism. They believed the nightmare was over. They had cut out the cancer. They could not have been more wrong. The disease had only metastasized. Weeks turned into months. Life in Blackwood Creek seemed to return to a semblance of normalcy. The harvest was good, the weather was mild, and the story of the witch's cabin began to recede from daily conversation into the realm of local legend. The Hemlock family, too, began to heal. Sarah was regaining her strength, and her laughter, once thought lost forever, echoed through the farmhouse once more. But the trauma had left its mark. John Hemlock was a changed man. The fire in his eyes had been replaced by a haunted, distant look. He became withdrawn, prone to long silences, often found staring up at the empty space on Hemlock Ridge. The porcelain doll remained locked away in the sheriff's office, a silent, forgotten relic of a dark night. One day, Sheriff Brody was found dead at his desk, having suffered what the doctor called a massive heart seizure. He was only 42. In the process of clearing out his office, the new sheriff, a younger man from a neighboring county, found the wooden box. Unaware of its significance, he saw it simply as the property of the town's most prominent family from the recent tragic events. Thinking it a kindness, a memento of their ordeal, he delivered the box to the Hemlock farm. Martha Hemlock accepted it with a trembling hand. She didn't want the object in her house, feeling a primal revulsion toward it, but John insisted it stay. He saw it as a trophy, a symbol of their victory over the evil that had tried to destroy them. He placed the porcelain doll on the mantelpiece in their living room, its vacant blue eyes gazing out over the family. The curse had found a new home, and its work was about to begin. The doll's presence in the Hemlock home was like a drop of ink in a glass of water, its influence spreading slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. It began with nightmares. Martha would wake up screaming, convinced she'd seen the doll standing at the foot of her bed, its painted smile wider, more malevolent in the moonlight. John dismissed her fears as the lingering effects of trauma. Then small, inexplicable things started to happen. Objects would move on their own. Glass would slide off a table. A door would slam shut in an empty hallway. The house, once a sanctuary, began to feel occupied. A persistent, unnatural chill settled in the living room, a cold that no fire in the hearth could dispel. Sarah, who had been recovering so well, began to regress. She grew quiet and sullen, and her parents would find her standing before the mantelpiece, having whispered conversations with the porcelain doll. Her new drawings were even more disturbing than before. She drew her own family as stick figures, but with their eyes scratched out, and standing beside them a large, smiling doll holding a burning torch. The macabre nature of these new drawings was a horrifying echo of her previous affliction. The joy of her recovery curdled into a new, more intimate kind of dread. The evil they thought they had vanquished from the ridge had followed them home. It was no longer a distant threat in a secluded cabin. It was sitting on their mantelpiece, watching them, waiting. John Hemlock, the man who had led the charge to destroy the witch, now found himself living in a house that was slowly becoming as haunted as her cabin ever was. His victory felt hollow, and a terrifying thought began to take root in his mind. What if the fire hadn't been an ending, but merely a transfer of power? The Hemlock family's descent into horror accelerated. Their livestock, once healthy and robust, began to die from a mysterious wasting sickness. Their crops failed, withering on the vine for no apparent reason. Financial ruin loomed, but it was the psychological decay that was most terrifying. John Hemlock's mind, already fragile, began to unravel completely. He became consumed by paranoia, convinced that Alara Vance had survived the fire and was stalking his family from the woods. He would spend his nights patrolling the property with a shotgun, firing at shadows, his frantic shouts echoing in the darkness. He claimed to hear the witch whispering to him from the walls of the house, her voice carried on the drafts that snaked through the old farmhouse. Martha, trapped in this living nightmare, could only watch as her husband and daughter were consumed by the same darkness. The doll on the mantelpiece remained the silent, unblinking epicenter of it all. One night, Martha tried to get rid of it. While John was outside on one of his manic patrols, she snatched the doll from the mantel, wrapped it in a burlap sack, and threw it down the old well in the yard. For a single day, a fragile peace seemed to settle over the house. But the next morning, as the family sat down for a silent, joyless breakfast, they saw it. The doll was back on the mantelpiece, its calico dress damp and stained with mud from the well, its porcelain face marred by a new, thin crack that ran from its hairline to its smiling lips. It looked as though it were sneering at them. The horrifying realization dawned on them. This thing, this curse, could not be discarded. It was a part of their family now, an unholy heirloom that they were bound to until the very end. Final act of the Hemlock family tragedy was as swift as it was brutal. In the winter of 1886, just over a year after the cabin fire, a traveling merchant seeking shelter from a sudden blizzard stumbled upon the Hemlock farm. He found the house disturbingly silent, with snow piling up against a door left slightly ajar. Pushing his way inside, he was met with a scene of unimaginable horror. The house was freezing cold, the hearth long dead. In the living room, he found the bodies. Martha Hemlock was slumped in a rocking chair, her body emaciated, her face a mask of frozen terror. John Hemlock was found in the barn, having taken his own life. And little Sarah, she was gone, vanished. There was no sign of a struggle, no tracks in the fresh snow leading away from the house. It was as if she had simply ceased to exist. On the mantelpiece, the porcelain doll sat in its usual place, its blue eyes staring blankly at the gruesome tableau. The authorities who investigated found John Hemlock's journal. Its final pages were a frantic, barely legible scrawl of madness and terror. He wrote of the doll whispering to Sarah, telling her secrets. He wrote that Alara was not dead, that she lived inside the doll and she was calling Sarah home. The last entry was a single chilling sentence. The witch has won. She has taken the child and left us the cold. The Hemlock farm was abandoned, left to be reclaimed by nature. The story of the family's demise became a terrifying postscript to the legend of the Witch of Hemlock Ridge. The cabin was gone, but the curse it had birthed was very much alive, and now it was mobile. The doll, the sole piece of evidence from the scene, was taken back into custody, a small, smiling object tainted by an entire family's destruction. The story of the witch's cabin could have faded into obscure local lore, but the porcelain doll ensured its immortality. After the horrifying discovery at the Hemlock farm, the doll was placed in the evidence locker at the Blackwood Creek Sheriff's Office. It sat in the dark, surrounded by confiscated whiskey stills and rusty murder weapons. But its malevolence could not be contained by a simple lock and key. Deputy Miller, a young man tasked with night duty, began to report disturbing occurrences. He would hear what sounded like a child humming a nursery rhyme coming from the evidence room. He'd unlock the door to find the room empty and silent, but the doll would be in a different position from where he'd left it. Sometimes it would be facing the door, other times it would be turned to face the wall, as if in punishment. Miller's reports were initially dismissed as the product of an overactive imagination, a young deputy spooked by local ghost stories, but his terror was genuine. He started refusing to work the night shift alone. He lost weight and dark circles appeared under his eyes. He told his wife he felt a constant sense of being watched, that he could feel the doll's cold, painted eyes on him even when he was at home. The horrifying climax came one evening when the sheriff, returning late, found the evidence room door swinging open. Inside, Deputy Miller was found dead, a victim of the same kind of sudden, inexplicable heart failure that had claimed Sheriff Brody 2 years prior. In his hand, he clutched a single, torn piece of calico fabric, identical to the material of the doll's dress. The curse, it seemed, was not tied to a family but to proximity. Anyone who kept the doll, anyone who stood watch over it, was in mortal danger. Death of Deputy Miller sent a fresh wave of terror through Blackwood Creek. The porcelain doll was no longer just a creepy relic. It was now considered a murder weapon, albeit one that operated by supernatural means. A town meeting was convened in the church, the same building where the mob had been summoned to march on Alara's cabin. The mood, however, was not of righteous anger, but of deep, sickening dread. They had created this monster, this vengeful, wandering curse, and now it was preying on them. The new sheriff, a man who had once scoffed at their superstitions, was now a believer. He wanted the doll gone. The pastor argued for a more spiritual solution. He proposed that the doll be exorcised, that it be ritually cleansed and then buried on consecrated ground, its evil laid to rest by the power of God. A special service was held. The doll was placed on the altar, its tiny form a profane centerpiece in the house of worship. The pastor, holding his Bible aloft, began to read the rites of exorcism, his voice booming through the nave. As he prayed, a series of disturbing events unfolded. The church grew unnaturally cold. The stained glass windows began to rattle violently in their frames, though there was no wind outside. The candles on the altar flickered and extinguished one by one, plunging the church into a gloomy twilight. The pastor's voice began to falter as he felt a palpable wave of malevolence pushing back against his faith. The ritual ended not with a sense of purification, but with a feeling of deep, unsettling violation. The doll, they realized, was not possessed by a simple demon that could be cast out. It was a vessel for something else, something older and more patient. The power of their god seemed to have no effect on it. The attempt to destroy the curse had only confirmed its strength. Following the failed exorcism, the town was desperate. Burying the doll on consecrated ground was no longer an option. The pastor feared it would taint the cemetery, a place that was supposed to be a final, peaceful resting place. Another, more drastic solution was proposed. They would give the doll back to the fire. They would build a pyre hotter and more intense than the one that consumed the cabin and melt the porcelain down to slag, destroying its physical form completely. They chose a remote, rocky outcrop far from the town, a place they felt was already barren and godless. The pyre was built and the townsfolk gathered, this time not as a vengeful mob but as a terrified congregation praying for deliverance. The sheriff, wearing thick leather gloves, placed the doll in the center of the pyre. The fire was lit. The flames roared to life, consuming the wood with incredible ferocity. The heat was immense, forcing the onlookers to retreat 100 yards. They watched, their faces grim, as the fire raged for hours. When it finally died down, they approached the smoldering ashes with cautious optimism. In the center of the pyre, they found a small, glassy lump of melted slag. The doll was gone, its form utterly destroyed. A collective sigh of relief went through the crowd. They had done it. They had finally ended the curse. They returned to their homes that night feeling a sense of finality, believing that the long nightmare that began with Alara Vance's arrival was truly, finally over. This time they were certain they were right. And this time their certainty would last for nearly half a century, long enough for the memory to fade, but not long enough for the evil to die. If you enjoy delving into these chilling cold cases from the darkest corners of history, make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on. The story of the witch's cabin is far from over, and its next chapter is the most disturbing yet. For 50 years, the land where Alara Vance's cabin once stood lay fallow. It became known to the locals as the Witch's Acre, a place of grim legend and whispered warnings. The trees around the blackened scar grew twisted and gnarled. No birds sang in their branches, and local wildlife seemed to shun the area entirely. Children who dared each other to step onto the cursed ground would return pale and shaken, complaining of a sudden unnatural cold and the feeling of being watched by unseen eyes. The story was passed down through generations, becoming a local ghost story, its sharp edges of truth worn smooth by time. The Hemlock family tragedy, the dead sheriffs, the porcelain doll, these became mere footnotes in a macabre fairy tale used to scare children into behaving. The town of Blackwood Creek grew and modernized. The dirt roads were paved, and electricity arrived, pushing the shadows of old superstitions into the corners. The events of 1885 seemed like a relic from a distant, more ignorant past. The cursed land was a blemish on the town's history, a place everyone knew about but no one spoke of publicly. It was a forbidden zone, its boundaries enforced not by fences but by fear and folklore. The fire that had destroyed the doll was seen as the definitive end. No one knew, or perhaps no one wanted to know, that you cannot kill a story with fire. An idea, a curse born of hatred and fear, has a life of its own. It can lie dormant, waiting patiently in the soil, in the memory of the land itself, for a new opportunity to take root. And in 1935, that opportunity would arrive in the form of a man who did not believe in ghosts. In the summer of 1935, a businessman from Lexington named Arthur Pike bought a large tract of land outside Blackwood Creek with the intention of building a modern family home, a summer retreat far from the city. The parcel he purchased, unbeknownst to him, included the Witch's Acre. The local real estate agent, eager to make a sale during the Great Depression, conveniently omitted the land's dark history. Pike was a man of the new century, a rationalist who scoffed at old-world superstitions. When construction began, some of the older local workers recognized the location and immediately quit, muttering about cursed ground. Pike laughed it off and hired a new crew from out of town. From the very beginning, the project was plagued by strange and sinister problems. Tools would vanish from the worksite overnight, only to reappear days later in impossible places, like the top of a half-finished chimney. Building materials would be found sabotaged, with support beams sawn halfway through and bags of cement inexplicably filled with grave dirt. The crew became unnerved. They reported hearing whispers on the wind when there was no breeze and the distinct sound of a child's laughter echoing from the woods at dusk. One worker fell from the roof in broad daylight, shattering his leg. He swore on his life that he hadn't slipped. He felt a pair of small, cold hands push him from behind. Pike, ever the pragmatist, blamed the incidents on disgruntled locals trying to scare him off. He posted armed guards at the site at night, but the disturbances only escalated. The curse, dormant for half a century, had been awakened by the intrusion. It was reasserting its claim on the land, and it did not welcome newcomers. The new house was being built on a foundation of ash and bone, and the architect of that original evil was beginning to stir. Despite the escalating problems, Arthur Pike was a stubborn man. He poured more money into the project, determined not to be intimidated by what he believed were the pranks of superstitious locals. The house was finally completed in the fall of 1936. It was a beautiful modern structure, a stark contrast to the dark, gnarled woods that surrounded it. Pike moved his wife, Alina, and their 10-year-old daughter, Lily, into their new summer home. For the first few weeks, all was quiet. The family enjoyed the solitude, the crisp autumn air, and the stunning views of the Kentucky hills. But the peace was a fragile illusion. The house had been built directly over the footprint of Alara Vance's cabin, and the land's dormant malevolence began to seep into its new foundation. Lily was the first to feel it. She began to complain of a new, imaginary friend. She called her Ellie. She said Ellie was a sad girl who lived in the walls of the house and wanted to play. At first, her parents dismissed it as a child's fantasy, a way to cope with the isolation of their new home. But Lily's descriptions of Ellie became more and more disturbing. She said Ellie had hair as black as night and eyes as gray as a storm. She said Ellie had been very badly burned and was looking for her favorite toy, a special doll that had been taken from her. The Pikes had no knowledge of the land's history, no idea that their daughter was describing, with chilling accuracy, a woman who had supposedly vanished in a fire 50 years earlier. They were living atop a grave, and their daughter was beginning to commune with its angry, restless spirit. The haunting of the Pike family escalated from imaginary friends to tangible, terrifying phenomena. Eleanor Pike began to experience vivid, horrifying nightmares. She dreamt she was in a small, dark cabin, the smell of strange herbs thick in the air. A woman with burning gray eyes would stare at her, whispering in a language she didn't understand, her words filled with ancient hatred. Eleanor would wake up with her heart pounding, the smell of smoke lingering in the room. The family started hearing noises at night. Footsteps in the empty upstairs hallway, the sound of furniture being dragged across the floor in a locked room, and most unnervingly, the soft, melancholic sound of a child humming. The house's modern amenities began to fail in bizarre ways. The electric lights would flicker and die in unison, plunging the house into darkness, while the brand-new furnace would inexplicably shut down, filling the home with a deep, penetrating cold, even on mild nights. Lily's behavior grew more erratic. She would have long, one-sided conversations with Ellie, and then fly into violent rages, claiming Ellie was angry that her home had been invaded. She began digging in the yard obsessively, telling her parents that Ellie had told her to find the heart, a special rock buried under the house. Arthur Pike, his rational worldview crumbling, began to suspect that something was deeply wrong. The locals in town shunned them, looking away when they came to buy supplies, their faces a mixture of pity and fear. The Pikes were learning what the Hemlocks had learned half a century before. The evil of that land was not a ghost story. It was a living, breathing entity, and it viewed their presence as a violation that required a violent response. The breaking point for the Pike family came during a violent thunderstorm one night. The power went out, leaving them in near total darkness, the house illuminated only by the strobing flashes of lightning. Lily began to scream from her bedroom. Arthur and Eleanor rushed to her room to find her standing on her bed, her body rigid, her eyes wide with terror. "She's here," Lily shrieked, pointing at an empty corner of the room. "Ellie is angry. She wants you to leave her house." As she screamed, the window in her room shattered inward, spraying glass across the floor, even though the wind outside was blowing in the opposite direction. A blast of freezing cold air filled the room, and with it, a low, guttural whispering sound that seemed to come from all directions at once. It was the same inhuman language that Sarah Hemlock had spoken decades earlier. In a flash of lightning, Eleanor swore she saw the silhouette of a tall, thin woman standing in the corner where Lily was pointing, her form made of shadow and rage. That was enough. Arthur Pike bundled his hysterical wife and daughter into the car and fled into the stormy night, leaving all their possessions behind. They never returned. They sold the property at a massive loss to a holding company, refusing to ever speak of what they had experienced in that house. The beautiful new home on the Witch's Acre was left abandoned, a modern monument to an ancient curse. The second attempt to build on that forbidden ground had ended in terror and flight. The land had once again violently rejected those who sought to tame it. The abandoned Pike house quickly became a new focal point for the local legend. It was a modern ghost house, a place of dares and terrifying rumors for a new generation. Teenagers would sneak onto the property at night, returning with stories of strange lights, disembodied voices, and doors slamming shut in the empty house. The legend of the witch's cabin was revitalized, now with a new, contemporary chapter. The story attracted the attention of a pair of paranormal investigators from Chicago in the late 1960s, a husband and wife team named Frank and Lorraine Peterson. They were pioneers in the field, equipped with reel-to-reel tape recorders, EMF meters, and a healthy dose of academic curiosity. They saw the Blackwood Creek case as a fascinating example of persistent, localized phenomena and multi-generational haunting. They spent a week in the town, interviewing the elderly residents who still remembered the original stories of Alara Vance and the Hemlock family. They painstakingly pieced together the timeline of events, from the fire in 1885 to the flight of the Pike family in 1936. They were the first to connect the Ellie that Lily Pike spoke of with the historical figure of Alara. The Petersons then decided to spend a night in the abandoned Pike house, hoping to capture empirical evidence of the haunting. They set up their equipment in the former living room, the very spot where Alara's cabin once stood. They hoped to record some unexplained noises, capture an anomaly on film. What they would encounter was far more active and malevolent than anything they had ever prepared for. They were about to learn that this was not a place for academic observation. It was a place of deep, violent anger, and it did not appreciate being studied. The Petersons' investigation inside the Pike house began quietly. For the first few hours, their sensitive audio equipment picked up nothing but the wind and the creaking of the settling house. But as midnight approached, the atmosphere inside the house began to change. The temperature dropped dramatically, their breath misting in the air. Their EMF meters, which had been silent, suddenly began to scream, their needles jerking wildly into the red. On their audio recorder, they captured what would later be called a classic Class A EVP, or electronic voice phenomenon. A clear, distinct whisper spoken right next to the microphone in a voice that was both childlike and ancient. It said a single word, "Get." This was followed by a loud, violent bang from the upstairs bedroom, Lily Pike's old room. Frank Peterson, the more skeptical of the two, went up to investigate with a camera and a flashlight. Lorraine remained with the equipment, her heart pounding. She heard Frank cry out in surprise, followed by the sound of a struggle and a heavy thud. She called his name, her voice trembling. There was no answer. A moment later, Frank came stumbling down the stairs, his face pale, his forehead bleeding from a fresh gash. He was frantic, babbling that all the furniture in the upstairs room had been thrown against the door from the inside, trapping him. But what truly terrified him was what he saw just before he broke free. Scratched into the wall in fresh, jagged letters that had not been there before was the name, ELARA. It was undeniable proof that the entity in the house was intelligent, aware of their presence, and deeply, violently hostile. Shaken but undeterred, the Petersons decided to press on. Their fear was now mixed with a jolt of professional excitement. They were on the verge of capturing groundbreaking evidence. They set up a motion-triggered camera aimed at the top of the stairs. They began a new EVP session, with Lorraine asking questions into the darkness. "Who are you?" she asked. "What do you want?" The response was not a whisper on tape, but a physical manifestation. The heavy oak dining table in the center of the room lifted several inches off the floor, hovered for a moment, and then slammed back down with a deafening crash that shook the entire house. The Petersons scrambled back in terror. Then from the darkness at the top of the stairs, a new sound emerged. It was the distinct, unmistakable sound of a small object being dragged slowly across the wooden floor. It was a rhythmic, scraping sound that grated on the nerves. It grew closer and closer, coming down the stairs one step at a time. Frank aimed his flashlight at the top of the staircase, its beam cutting through the oppressive darkness. The scraping stopped. In the center of the top step, revealed in the shaky beam of the flashlight, sat a small, dark object. It was a crude, handmade doll, fashioned from twigs and twine, almost identical to the one Sarah Hemlock had been found within the woods over 80 years before. It was an object that should not have existed, a macabre echo of the past, a totem of the original curse. As they stared in horrified disbelief, the twig doll suddenly flew through the air, launched by an unseen force, and shattered against the wall just inches from Lorraine's head. That was the end of the investigation. The Petersons grabbed what equipment they could and fled the house, not stopping until they were back in the relative safety of their motel room. They had captured incredible evidence: the EVP, the photographs of the scratches on the wall, the recording of the table levitating. But they also left with the chilling certainty that the entity in that house was not just a residual memory, but a powerful and malevolent intelligence. In their official report, they theorized that the entity was a unique and complex form of haunting. They didn't believe it was simply the ghost of Alara Vance. Instead, they proposed that the violent, traumatic event of the 1885 fire, combined with the intense fear and hatred of the mob, had created something new. They called it a tulpa, or a thought-form entity, a being created and sustained by decades of collective belief and fear. Alara may or may not have been a witch in life, but the town's belief in her evil had posthumously made her one. The land itself had become a psychic battery, charged with the negative energy of the original event and nourished by the subsequent tragedies of the Hemlocks and the Pikes. The so-called curse was, in their view, a self-perpetuating psychic wound on the landscape. The various objects, the porcelain doll, the twig dolls, were not the source of the evil, but merely focal points, physical anchors that the entity used to interact with the world. Their report was published in a small, obscure paranormal journal and was largely ignored by the mainstream. But for those who read it, it offered the most terrifying explanation of all. The witch in the cabin wasn't a person. It was an idea, and you can't kill an idea. The final, and perhaps most disturbing, chapter in the history of the witch's cabin came to light in the late 1990s. A local historian named Alastair Finch was researching old county records for a book on Appalachian folklore. He stumbled upon the file for the 1885 cabin fire, filed under unresolved arson vanishment. Buried deep within the file, mislabeled and forgot for over a century, was a small, leather-bound journal. It was Alara Vance's journal. It had been recovered from a small, fireproof strongbox found in the ashes, but its existence had been suppressed by the sheriff at the time, likely to protect the townsfolk from the truth. The journal's contents did not paint the picture of a malevolent witch. They painted a picture of a tragic, misunderstood woman. Alara Vance was a trained botanist and herbalist from a wealthy family in Philadelphia. She had come to the remote Kentucky hills seeking solitude after the death of her husband and young daughter from diphtheria. The strange herbs she gathered were for medicinal tinctures and salves. The strange language she was heard speaking was likely Latin, the scientific language of botany. The symbols carved on her door were not demonic sigils, but old folk symbols meant to ward off illness and evil spirits, a desperate attempt to protect herself. She was not an aggressor, she was a victim, a woman whose grief and scientific knowledge were misinterpreted as witchcraft by a fearful, ignorant community. The journal revealed a lonely, educated woman, charting the local flora, grieving her lost family, and becoming increasingly frightened by the hostility of her neighbors. The monster of the legend was, in reality, just a heartbroken woman seeking peace. The most horrifying revelation in Alara's journal concerned the Hemlock family. She wrote about little Sarah Hemlock, whom she had encountered wandering in the woods near her cabin. She described the child as listless and pale, already showing signs of a strange illness. Far from cursing the child, Alara had tried to help her. She recognized the symptoms of a severe neurological disorder. possibly caused by ergot poisoning from contaminated rye grain, which was known to cause convulsions and hallucinations. She had given the child a simple wooden doll and a calming herbal tea, and then gently guided her back towards her family's farm. Alara wrote of her growing fear of John Hemlock, whom she described as a man with a fever in his eyes, and of her sorrow for his sick child. The true evil, the journal suggested, was not supernatural but tragically mundane, a fungal infection in the town's grain supply, interpreted through the lens of religious fanaticism and superstition. The events that followed were a horrifying cascade of misinterpretation and mass hysteria. Sarah's demonic speech was the babbling of a delirious, poisoned child. Her recovery after the fire was likely a coincidence, the batch of tainted grain having run out. The fire, the mob, the destruction, it was all based on a terrible, tragic mistake. The town of Blackwood Creek had not purged a demon. In their fear and ignorance, they had murdered an innocent, grieving woman. The weight of this revelation was immense. It recontextualized the entire legend. The haunting of the land was not the work of a vengeful witch. It was the legacy of a profound injustice. It was the rage of a murdered woman, an indelible stain of guilt left upon the soul of the community. The journal contained one final macabre twist, a detail that plunged the story back into the depths of the truly inexplicable. In her final entries written in the days leading up to the fire, Alara wrote about the land itself. She noted that long before she arrived, the local Native American tribes had shunned the area, referring to it in their language as the place where the earth weeps. She described a strange, oppressive quality to the woods, a miasma of old sorrow that seemed to rise from the soil. She discovered a small, hidden cemetery deep in the woods on her property, with graves marked by simple, unadorned fieldstones. The graves were small, child-sized. There were no records of who was buried there. Her research led her to believe the land had been the site of some forgotten tragedy, perhaps a settlement that had been wiped out by disease or violence long before Blackwood Creek was even founded. This was the most chilling part of her writing. Alara Vance had not brought the evil to Hemlock Ridge. She had merely settled on top of a place that was already deeply, fundamentally wrong. She was not the source of the curse, she was just its most famous victim. The porcelain doll then took on a new, more horrifying significance. It was never Alara's. In one entry she described finding it half buried near one of the child's graves as if it were a votive offering. She took it back to her cabin to clean it, an act of respect for the forgotten dead. The doll was not a vessel for Alara's spirit. It was an artifact of the land's original, ancient sorrow. It was a conduit for a much older, much more patient entity. This final piece of information reframes everything. The haunting of the Witch's Acre was not born in the fire of 1885, it was merely awakened by it. The violent injustice done to Alara Vance acted as a blood sacrifice, a powerful surge of negative energy that supercharged the latent malevolence of the land. Alara's spirit, if it lingered at all, was just one more voice in a chorus of tragedy that echoed through that hollow. The entity the Petersons encountered was not just Alara or a tulpa created by the town. It was the genius loci of the place itself, the spirit of a wounded, sorrowful land now amplified by the rage of a murdered woman. It explains the persistence of the curse, its ability to attach to objects and families to endure for over a century. It was not the ghost of a person, but the ghost of a place. The porcelain doll, the twig dolls, the house itself, they were all just temporary tools used by this ancient, territorial intelligence to lash out at those who trespassed on its grief. The true horror of the witch's cabin is not that a witch was burned there, but that an innocent woman was sacrificed to a place that was already haunted, her tragedy becoming the fuel for a much older fire. The residents of Blackwood Creek, in their attempt to destroy a monster of their own imagination, had inadvertently fed and strengthened a real one that had been sleeping beneath their feet all along. They had turned a place of quiet sorrow into a place of active, violent rage. Today, the land where the witch's cabin once stood remains empty. The Pike House, after decades of vacancy and vandalism, was finally torn down by the county in the 1980s. They cleared the land, hoping to finally erase the physical reminder of the town's dark history. But nothing has ever been built there again. The plot of land remains for sale, but no one in the region will buy it. It is a permanent dead zone, a patch of real estate rendered worthless by its own macabre history. The legend persists, stronger than ever, now woven from a complex tapestry of historical fact, folklore, paranormal investigation, and the chilling contents of Alara's journal. Alastair Finch's book was published, and the truth of Alara's innocence is now known, but this knowledge has done little to quell the stories. If anything, it has made them more potent. The haunting is no longer seen as the work of a one-dimensional evil witch, but as the righteous, tragic rage of a wronged spirit, fused with an even older sorrow. The story has become a permanent part of the cultural landscape of eastern Kentucky, a cautionary tale about the dangers of fear, ignorance, and the darkness that can lie hidden in the most remote and beautiful of places. The fire of 1885 is long out, but the embers of that night continue to glow in the collective memory of the town, a warning that some places are meant to be left alone, and some stories should never be forgotten. And what of the artifacts of the curse? The fate of the porcelain doll remains a disturbing, unsolved mystery. After the failed attempt to destroy it by fire in the 1880s, the lump of melted slag was supposedly buried in an undisclosed location by the sheriff. However, local rumors and Finch's research suggest a different, more unsettling story. Some claim the slag was stolen by a member of the mob, a man who became obsessed with its power, only for his family line to wither and die out under mysterious circumstances. Another more popular theory is that the fire did not destroy the doll's essence at all. The story goes that over time, the lump of glassy slag buried in the cursed earth of Hemlock Ridge slowly began to reform itself, the malevolent energy of the place knitting the porcelain back together, molecule by molecule. It's a fantastic, impossible idea, yet it persists. Treasure hunters and paranormal enthusiasts still occasionally search the woods around the Witch's Acre, hoping to find the legendary cursed doll or at least the glassy remnant of its supposed destruction. No one has ever found it. It, like Sarah Hemlock and Alara Vance, has simply vanished from the historical record, leaving only a terrifying legend in its wake. Its absence is almost more frightening than its presence. Is it still out there, buried, waiting, or did it find its way into the world again, a small, smiling vessel of ancient sorrow passing from hand to hand, a silent plague upon the houses of the unsuspecting? The true legacy of the witch's cabin is not a physical haunting, but a story that refuses to die. It is a perfect, self-sustaining ghost story, a narrative machine that generates its own dread. The cabin was built, burned, and rebuilt, only to be abandoned and torn down. The doll was found, passed around, and destroyed, only to vanish into legend. The characters, the innocent herbalist, the grieving father, the terrified children, the paranormal investigators, have all played their parts and faded into history. But the narrative remains. It has become a permanent feature of the landscape, as real and as tangible as the gnarled trees that still grow on the Witch's Acre. The story itself is now the haunted house. Every time it is told, the cabin is rebuilt in the minds of the listeners. Every time the doll is described, its cold porcelain eyes stare out from the darkness of the imagination. The fire did not kill Alara Vance's memory, it immortalized it. It transformed a quiet, lonely woman into a powerful, enduring archetype of fear. The curse in its truest form is the story, and it has proven to be unkillable. It continues to claim the land, to keep it empty, to enforce its own forbidden boundary through the power of pure narrative. The cabin burned, but it never truly died because it was rebuilt as a legend, a structure made of whispers and warnings, a place that can be visited by anyone brave or foolish enough to listen to its macabre history. The tale of the witch's cabin is a chilling reminder of how easily fear can create its own monsters. It is a cold case, not of a single murder, but of a collective act of violence that echoed through generations, poisoning a piece of land with its memory. Was Alara Vance a witch? No. But the events that transpired on that ridge in 1885 created something just as real, just as dangerous. They birthed a story with a life of its own, a specter woven from injustice, sorrow, and raw, primal fear. The land on Hemlock Ridge remains quiet today. The woods have reclaimed the small clearing where so much terror unfolded. But locals say that on certain moonless nights, if you stand at the edge of the old property line, you can still feel it. A profound, unnatural cold that has nothing to do with the weather. And sometimes, carried on the wind, you can hear a faint, sorrowful sound. It is not the laughter of a child anymore. It is the sound of a woman weeping softly in the darkness, forever bound to the place where her life was stolen, a permanent guardian of a land that weeps with her. The fire is long gone. The cabin is dust, but the horror, like a deep stain, remains. It burned, but it never, ever died.